Okay, very good. Well, all right. Presumably that's rolling. All right. Thank you. Good to see folks. Thanks for turning up again and being here. I sincerely hope that the the materials that I sent out weren't. You could finally sort that out. I tried to make it as clear as possible, but I didn't realize how vague I was on Tylenol 3 after oral surgery. That's anyway. It was rather pleasant for me, but it didn't come out too well for you. So I had to go back and say, "Oh, here's the correct chapter." That other one is an academic use of how to get your pieces of paper gathered together. So I hope everybody has the correct copy now. I sent it out earlier today.
No,
Anyway,
I don't have it because I go on Fridays. You know.
yeah,
No, I
yeah.
don't. Oh,
Okay,
it is.
well, I'm going to make sure you get a
I'll
copy.
get it. I'll get it next Friday, I guess.
Well, I can. I'll send you a copy of the text of the hard copy anyway, and I'm going to
Oh,
go through it real carefully today anyway. So, um, and it has two addenda. One that includes a little bit about Gnosticism's influence on the Christian uh, uh, mysticism, and that's Appendix F, and Appendix G um, includes Egyptian mysticism, a bit of it, just a touch, and some Judaic and Mosaic um, mysticism, pre-Christian, just a little bit. These things, this in particular, it strikes me, can just run wild. It can be all over the place. So a lot of what I've been doing editing wise is reining in so that I don't get all over the place too much and can keep focused on the Christian period from Jesus up to our present time. So anyway, you got a little view there of what the academic process is. Incidentally, it might be interesting for you to hear. This would be approximately the stage if I were a candidate for a doctoral in this subject, that I would gather my advisors and they would say, all right, don't pay any attention to this, never mind that, narrow down more, get your theme going, build it, and so on and so forth. So we might do that as an exercise at some time and say, all right, how would you make a through line here to have information that isn't too narrow and is certainly not too broad? Anyway, it's an awful lot of fun and it only takes several years. So but we're limited today to to an hour and a half or a little less than that now. Okay, I am going to refer a lot today to the material that I sent you, the correct material, and that's the one, Chapter 3, the real one, um, of Christian mysticism and its evolution. And here's this, a lot of this is my take on it. So, like a candidate who has moved on in the material, I started to decide, oh, I see a structure in all of this information, or I can lay a structure on it without destroying the information and learn more, hopefully. That would be the objective. And that's another thing the advisors would say. What structure are you using and you're going to build and so forth. So anyway, and that in this instance is, if you recall this, which is this was Appendix E a little ways back, and that's the select list of some of the outstanding uh, major well-known mystics in Christian history, from St. Paul and Dionysius the Areopagite on up to today. So you've seen that, and if you happen to print that out for yourself, you might look at it now, um, and we'll refer some to it. As you know from one of the other appendices that I sent to you early on in the first class, there over 500 mystics, Christian mystics that are known. And nobody knows how many are unknown, but it really became quite the thing to do throughout Christianity. We might today have thousands and thousands. I don't know, of course, and the number doesn't matter anyway. But with the new mysticisms of the 19th and 20th century that have developed, I think there are many people who are practicing mysticism in many various ways. And we'll address that a little bit today. Well, anyway, so I want to start off with this too. And if you don't have a printout and so on, maybe you can see this just enough to get an idea. The idea that I superimposed on this as I was working on it was that it seemed to me there are three fairly distinct periods in the history of Christian mysticism. So anyway, that's part of that structure that I have put upon this list, and periods 1, 2, and 3 going through time, because there are notable changes that subtly and gradually happen between those periods, but it makes it so much easier to envision uh, who was where in all of these mystics and what was evolving, which is a pretty subtle thing in many instances, but quite profound. So that's what I have added to the right-hand side of this graph, and that is 1, 2, and 3, periods 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so now you know what I'm referring to. Now, it helps, I think, to explain it a little bit further as well. I say in the chapter text that on the right-hand side of this graph, it primarily deals with the spiritual history and evolution, and the left-hand side, primarily the philosophical evolution. That's not a hard and fast thing, except that clearly we have Moses and Gnosticism and so forth on the right-hand side, and certainly by the time of St. Paul, by then, clearly there's a track of Christian mysticism that is moving through time. And then on the left side, starting with Plato and Aristotle, and then moving up through the Neoplatonists, that is, those who use Plato's structure for thinking, not all the answers, but how shall we think these profound issues through? And they weren't directly the spiritual issues, but of course they were so parallel to that one can't help but see the relationships very often between philosophical evolution in thinking through the structures of Plato primarily, but also Aristotle, and then the spiritual, which is evolution of a very different sort. It's evolution as seen in intuition and insight and pursuing belief. Find out what do I believe in all of this, and they crisscross and overlap a lot. And I've mentioned it before in an earlier class. Just take the idea of one, as in one God, and one as in the origin of the universe, which is possibly a rather dense black hole. At least that's the thinking in the scientific community. And of course, the philosophical side over time becomes more and more scientific. That's a natural evolution for philosophy to tend toward the scientific. But we don't want us on the mystical side, the spiritual side, just to reduce the universe to a machine. I'd said that before in the second class and was quoting. I didn't make that up. I wish I had. But anyway, the universe is much more than a machine, but scientifically, we can look at it that way, how gravity acts on bodies in space and so forth. But We are pursuing something more than that, and that is, of course, the mystical conception of a cosmos. And it took some time to come to realize the difference between cosmos and universe. And more of that's going to be discovered and talked about today as we go along. We have quite a bit so far. All right, so with that kind of grounding idea, I proceed with the text of chapter 3. All right, it's an abbreviated historical list, of course, of the best known Christian mystics and their antecedents, some of them. It also includes some cultural references to provide context. There are some well-known names that are missing from this, but that's not because they're less significant by any means. It's just for the sake of greater brevity. All right, now here's another thing that as a candidate I propose to my committee, and that is that Christian mysticism apparently or appears to stand on two kind of pedestals throughout history. The one reflected on the right in the graph, the spiritual values and beliefs. And then the other pedestal on the left are the philosophical foundations. And I've already kind of addressed that. So following that as a structure for as long as it holds up, that's something that is also helping this. Okay, now let's see. Further, the oldest spiritual foundations are reflected in Egyptian mysticism. We'll look at that a little bit later, but the idea of divinity enters into Egyptian mysticism in a way that looks like a prototype for Christianity, if we think about it. And that is, God invests a human, namely Pharaoh, with divine powers to rule the earth, and that power has a son whose name is Horus. Well, the god is Ra, R-A, and has been for a long time. And then somehow or another generates a son, Horus, and both of them are gods of the sun, S-U-N, and that appears in various ways in those myths as we think of them. And then gradually, and it's pretty amazing, the god takes on more and more attributes as time passes, even to the point gradually where a basic morality enters in. It's as you look at it, it's almost as though right from the get-go, they were looking for something to explain morality, or whatever all that entails, but good and bad, and do this and avoid that, and so on and so forth. And gradually, and it takes about 2,000 years to do this, the descriptions of and the depictions of a moral element, dimension, I call it, a moral dimension in those myths appears with a triadic base supporting it. That very much looks like a structural prototype to subsequent religious beliefs and so forth. Okay, so now let's move up. That's just a little preview there of coming attractions, we might say. The three periods that I see in mystical evolution. First, from Paul the Apostle to Johannes Scotus Eriugena. There's might be a new name to you, but it's an extremely important one. We'll see why as we go along. The fundamental doctrines of Christianity are argued and laid out by the first Christian philosopher, Origen of Alexandria, I had wanted to include him, but it just took too much time because he's in the philosophical line. By the Desert Fathers and Mothers, by St. Augustine of Hippo, by the Church Fathers, who are not to be confused with, well, anyway, there are two groups of church fathers, but anyway, a particular threesome of fathers. And at the First Council of Nicaea, and by Pseudo Dionysius and his contemporaries, based on the philosophical structures laid down by Plato and Aristotle. Now, I had only heard the name of of Dionysius, the Areopagite, and had no idea who that was. It just sounded really quite funny. Well, actually, he appears in the Bible, and he was an Athenian, but he heard and was present with Paul the Apostle on Corinth, and appears in the Corinthian letters and speeches of Paul. And he was deeply moved by that, by what he heard, and offered an interpretation, complex interpretation of what he heard that appears first in Old Greek and later is translated into Latin. And so it grows into the Christian tradition. But he, that is Dionysius the Areopagite, he converts almost immediately to Christianity. He says, I will pursue this and find out more of the truth. And he becomes one of the first bishops, if not the first bishop, of Athens as it was being Christianized. Okay, and so we will be picking up on and hearing more about him a little bit as we go on. Now, let me jump to a curious thing. The Pseudo Dionysius was not the original one. In fact, there are 3 centuries that are separating the two. But Pseudo Dionysius was the major translator of what Dionysius the Areopagite had written in Old Greek. And so it became more widely available, being in Latin. And that is still a touchstone in modern scholarship for referring back to those very early early beginnings, yeah, of Christian thought. It's Pauline, yes, but not entirely. It's also very broad. It gives broad thinking to the Christian belief as it was evolving and appearing through mystical practices primarily. Well, Pseudo Dionysius, it was customary in those days, in his time, of to honor the original author by using that author's name. So a lot of scholars think that that was the intention of who we know as Pseudo Dionysius. Others say, well, maybe not so much. He was a plagiarist. So you can make your choice on that, I guess. But in any case, he did provide the text that really was building up in this first period of the development of mysticism, not only in mysticism per se, but in the whole of church doctrine. So we have that as very, very basic material to work from. Just a side note here, Areopagite, that he is associated with, Dionysius the Areopagite, refers to a judiciary council, the Areopagus of Athens, which was referred to by the leaders of Athens for judicial decisions and the likes. And Dionysius was a member of that council. So that's how that name came about, Dionysius the Areopagite. And his translator, Pseudo Dionysius, also carries that full name. Pseudo Dionysius the Areopagite. So there we've got that tangle kind of sorted out. All right. Yeah. Is there somebody?
That
Yeah.
transliteration
Yeah.
gets transliterated into Dennis. So sometimes he's known as Saint Dennis.
Saint Denis, yes, or Denise, Denys. Typically, it's the way it's spelled. And that was the name over in Paris originally of the the patron saint Saint Denis, and it is thought that that is that transliteration that's moved over there. Did you come across that too, Harvey?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, the school in Paris was originally known as the monastery of Saint Denis or Saint Denis, Denys.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was spreading across way, and then eventually that monastery became Cluny, which was an amazing monastery. Well, this is a side note, but anyway, and the building of Cluny stood until when, 1880 or something like that. It lasted that long. All right, well, that's just a little thing you can bring up in your let's play a game nights and see who's got more information that you'll never use again. Okay, so the first period, and we'll go into it in depth further, it's really, really fascinating, is this gathering of basic ideas and searchings and so forth, very often by mystical means, into what is Christianity. So this is before doctrines were becoming really concretized. However, that certainly did begin at the Council of Nicaea, thanks to Constantine in 325, the first Council of Nicaea, which Constantine called. And there, these discussions were starting to develop into doctrines for the church or a church. Now, there's a political impetus behind this. Constantine was having a lot of trouble keeping the empire intact. You know, the Germanics were heading off one way in their thinking, and the French another. And of course, they weren't German and French in those days, but there was that kind of thinking in the, depending if you're French, or there was that kind of thinking if you're German. You get the idea here. I'm just showing off. And a lot from Spain, and from Ethiopia, from what is Persia, which is now Iran, and so forth. And this over 300 bishops and their deacons gathered at this Council of Nicaea. Well, Constantine, as you know, he did not persecute the Christians, at least to the extent that Diocletian did, which was terrible. We'll address more about that when we talk about the Desert Fathers. But anyway, so Diocletian, of course, was martyring and destroying the Christians because they would not see him, Diocletian, as divine and the God. So that triggered these horrible times of martyring. We call it martyring, but it was just removing and destroying Christians in Rome and throughout the empire as much as possible. But Constantine, he stopped that, though he remained a pagan clear up until his deathbed, and he was baptized a Christian at that time. But he was supported. But he said, I want you people to get together. So if your belief, which is becoming Christianity, is going to be really significant and important, then I'm counting on you to bring yourselves together into one church of doctrine, of belief, of behavior, and stay in the Roman Empire and quit giving me trouble just because you're fighting with each other. So there, in a very few words, is a political explanation of the reason for the Council of Nicaea. It wasn't all that lofty from Constantine's point of view. Well, maybe that is lofty. He was keeping the empire, trying to keep the empire together. So, but a major benefit of it to Christianity was the First Council of Nicaea. And there, those very issues and questions did come up right away. And that is, how do we conceive of the divinity of the one, of God? God was recognized as a thing, certainly. That had been established already, in the Jewish cult, the Judeo-Christian cult that Matthew, the gospel writer Matthew, represents so much in his writing and his thinking. Well, that was already clear. But what is the nature of God? So these are really basic things. This, the trouble or difficulty in conceiving of a Trinity, very difficult. So there were many thoughts and ideas about that, and lots of arguing and disagreement at these basic levels. So that was a great part of the importance of Council of Nicaea. There were several councils after that. That was not the only one. I think there were 31 over a period of how many years? I've forgotten. Harvey, do you know? Pardon me?
I think there were only 7.
Oh, only 7. Council of Constantinople and so forth. Yeah. Of 7. Oh, all right. Okay, I must have. Yeah.
Until the
They covered a long period, maybe 300 years or so, over a period of 300 years. All right, now over on the spiritual side, period. Then, all right, let's look at some of the things that were coming up here. What have I done? I just scooted something. Oh, I don't really want to do chat room yet. All right, I don't think I hit that, but let me see. How do I go out? Because you can't see me. All right, here we go again. All right. So let me read from this and interpret as we go along. For obvious reasons, St. Paul's voice was the strongest one on the spiritual side of the scale. He himself had a profound mystical experience, we can say, when on the road to Damascus, he was confronted by a vision of Christ and fell off his donkey, or if you wish, off his ass, and was blinded for 3 days. It changed his life, certainly, from tax collector to apostle for Christ, though he had not been a disciple. I think we all know that. We know this story well, but it was an Athenian pagan, Dionysius, the Areopagite, who heard the words of Paul in Corinth and was instantly converted to follow the Christ. This is in Acts of the Apostles 17:34. It can be traced into Matthew, the Acts of the Apostles. Okay, we know a little bit about Dionysius so far. I've given you some, but it was not until sometime before 532 that the pseudo Dionysius brought that into legible Latin history. Okay, let's see. Now I'm moving on up to pseudo Dionysius, and what comes up in what he translates. This is tricky stuff. So anybody who knows more about it than I do, certainly, which is quite possible, and and the likes, or knows some nuances that would be good to know, please pipe up. Um, Theoria is the main theme of Dionysius's work. The mystical theology, which was a written work, one of the written works coming out of Dionysius, in chapter 1, he says that God dwells in divine darkness. All right. And God is unknowable through sense and reason. Well, there is something that becomes embedded in on the spiritual side. Of course, this has nothing to do with the philosophical side, but the spiritual side, and built on building the pedestal there, right early on. God dwells in divine darkness. Well, darkness becomes a very important theme that changes in how you interpret it through the history of the mystics. Certainly, you know that the term darkness is associated with St. John of the Cross, but by many others as well, of the mystics. And darkness isn't described further at this stage, but attached to it is God is unknowable through sense and reason. All right, this is a real major step of theological thinking rather than philosophical, and is building the spiritual line that is Christian identified very clearly. Not that other mystical religions, certainly India, Hindu religions and so forth, often see the ultimate power as something dark, as great darkness, and it isn't always good either. It's frequently scary and evil, not evil, but punishing, like Kali, so on and so forth. But we're talking about the Christian evolution now, and that darkness, which you see, still clinging to that idea a little bit, is the philosophical side. That is, God is unknowable through sense and reason. We think about that a little bit. It begins to move us into the realm of insight and intuition, to read that, to trust it, to live in it, as different from the knowledge that comes from the senses, which we all love and depend on, and the knowledge of reason, which is much more abstract. Okay, so here this is introduced. We keep hanging on to that and see how that evolves in the thinking through time. All right. Therefore, a person must leave behind the activity of sense and reason and enter into spiritual union with God. Through spiritual union with God, which is called theosis, Theosis, the mystic is granted theonia, and through this vision is ultimately given knowledge of God. All right, so begin to be, of course, in Latin and Greek and Latin, terms that appear that begin to name these experiences that move toward the mystical side. All right, theosis. The mystic is granted the vision is ultimately given of the knowledge of God. Theoria is the lifting up of the individual out of time, space, and created being, while the triune God reaches down or descends to the heis chast. I'll be going through that word with you in just a moment here. H-E-S-Y, C-H-A-S-T, hesychast. I'm giving it, obviously, an English-American pronunciation. I don't know what sounds it quite stands for, and I haven't looked that up yet. This process is also known, however, as, and we do know this one, ecstasis. So this is the process of becoming as ecstatic. All right, and that is being lifted up uh, out of time, space, and created being. Ah, okay, we're definitely moving into the mystical realm, shall we call it, for the spiritual side's development and growth. All right. And also, this even tells us a little bit about behavior. The mystics of the day, of whom probably there were very many, went into such deep meditations that that they drifted out of space and time and the realities of the day and had other visions or yeah, insights, and were building intuitions. All right. Now, Hesychast, do you know how to say that for sure, Harvey or Jim? Casey, H-E?
Hesychastic? Is that related to hesychastic?
Oh, yes, it is. Yeah.
Hes- yeah, hesychastic. Um, the hesychasm was a throne room. You know,
Yeah.
when it says that, um, what's his name? Oh, gosh, the prophet, one before Jeremiah. Um,
Oh,
when he went into the house, it
yeah.
really is this palace before God, and it's
Uh-huh.
moving into God's palace,
Alice.
God's
Yeah.
God's throne room.
Right. Right. Uh, yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. The throne was a symbolic suggestion from very deep in Jewish history too, which I had to skip. But it was fascinating about access to the throne of God was a major objective of Judaism in its time of its origins and the likes, the throne of God. And
Isaiah was the one I was thinking of. Isaiah.
Isaiah, oh, the big guy, right?
Yeah.
Isaiah is confronted with God and so I'm unfit to come into your presence, but he was lifted up to God's house.
Yeah.
God's
Good.
a palace is a big deal in Judaism. As this darkness, moving through the darkness, Moses and the people with him moved through the darkness,
The darkness.
place
Yeah.
where they could see God, which is interesting because later
Yeah.
on in Exodus it says nobody can see God.
Nobody can see God, right? Right. Well, thanks for that, tying that together. Yeah, and I did read quite a lot too about this throne of God. It is a trans image expression of older symbology, which the golden throne of the ancient God of the sun uh, became the throne representing the Jews' belief
Yeah,
in the throne
the
of God.
stochastic movement within Judaism, it's the throne is a fiery chariot.
Yeah,
The
chariot.
chariot. But when Moses and the people come into God's presence, they feel like they're standing on a floor that's crystal clear, made out of sapphire or something.
Yeah, something like that.
That becomes an important symbol in hesychastic Judaism in the period the destruction after the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
You find this in the Talmud, where it's a big deal to come into God's presence, and you stand on this clear, glassy surface, and the word is, don't look down and say, "Oh, I think I'm going to fall through this thing." That'll get you cast out of God's presence immediately.
Oh, yes, yes. Uh-huh. Yeah, and there are angels that are gathered around God and test you every step of the way. And they say, this is very
Yeah.
dangerous. Are you sure you want to approach God? you could burst into flames and be destroyed. And also the story of the sapphire floor too. Yeah. So this is really deep. It's fascinating. This evolution is an evolution of how ideas are imaged and expressed metaphorically as we go along too. Um, yeah, the throne, before the throne was the chariot, because the sun, of course, moves across the sky for of a day, and that's the flaming chariot then that is transferred imagetically into the throne, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, we know that the importance of light in modern Christianity. It is light. We don't bother with the throne and with the chariot anymore and the sapphire floor. Okay, yeah, wonderful. Thanks very much. Okay, did I hear somebody else have something they want to pitch in here? Okay. All right. Well, let me see. I told you about that. Now, the hesychast is a term not, and that term itself wasn't actually coined until the 20th century. 20th, I beg your pardon, 14th century. So it was fairly far along in Christian building that took on this term. I think the story was there, or elements of the story, but it got this name in the 14th century. Anyway, but it refers to the practice and to the practitioner of a method of mental ascesis, ASCESIS. Another word we don't come across every day, which is, John Everhart will appreciate this, severe self-discipline for religious reasons. Ascesis.
Ascetic.
Yep. And of course, the word aesthetic comes from that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now that involves the use of the Jesus prayer, and we'll refer to that a little bit later from the Desert Fathers, which is like an incantation recited at regular times of the day, usually like a mantra or the Nicene Creed or even a rosary. Anyway, it's a repeated, rigorous self-discipline, or it's included in the self-disciplines. And that is assisted by certain psychophysical techniques. Well, now, and that comes down to stress positions. Maybe that's something that was picked up from the East too, John. I don't know. Like yogic, extreme yogic positions are almost fatal. Extremely difficult stress positions. Well, at this time in the building of the Christian whole faith and belief system, and its mystical element, which is so important to its growth and belief. So we have the Jesus prayer repeated like an incantation, assisted by certain psychophysical techniques, which include stress positions. This we know are among the early origins of mystical practices in Christian mysticism. Now, nowadays, there's not much of that left. Now, incantation, yes, of course, saying over and over again something that is of great meaning to one. The stress positions have been modified quite a lot into health building yogic exercises and so forth, or positions that they are stressful. I can't sit in the yogic positions, but other people can, and with practice they can become it. But it's not like what is referred to here. Let me talk a little bit more about that psychophysical. That I know something about, being a dancer. We refer to it as psychokinesthetic. And that's a feedback system within the body, within the mind, and the whole body, of where physical activity informs and creates a psychic response. And one actually begins to, in a manner of speaking, transform as motion, certain techniques of motion are practiced. Now, think about that with relationship even to dancers. Ballet, of course, would be a good example of that. The positions and even the movement patterns of ballet are highly pre-formed. They really are gestures. But their gestures, they're kinesthetic, they're sensed and felt through the body. And they have a feedback to the psyche. So one on stage even seems to, or does to some degree, transform into the Sugar Plum Fairy, the princess, Clara at the Christmas party, and so on and so forth. So it's a controlled phenomenon. Usually ballet dancers don't suddenly go into fits on stage unless somebody has stepped on their toe shoe, but or pulled on their tutu. Anyway, that is highly controlled now. Now, many of you probably have experienced it, whether you realize it or not. Several years ago, certainly not anymore, I was quite a runner. I ran 65 miles a week, sometimes up to 75. And of course, experienced runner's high. Well, that was part of the objective. The sense of the running and its repetition, the kinesthetic experience, for miles and miles and miles. You become that energy, and all else of reality, except an approaching bus, perhaps, becomes irrelevant. And it is the energy of the running itself and the feedback, the kinesthetic feedback that induces the high, the runner's high. Now that's very addictive, I learned, and had to divest myself of that practice, which became a daily habit. It can be quite addictive, and it doesn't require any hallucinatory drugs or anything like that. It's your own body. So that is very much a part of this general thing of psychophysical techniques and a way to relate to that. Even if you haven't been a runner or experienced that, you certainly have witnessed it, and you know people who pursue that. Well, it's a related thing to this serious religious practice, which is the repetition of a prayer. Repetition is essential to entering the mystical state, whether it's a chant or whether it's a drum beat or simply, we would say, nonsense syllables. I had a student who studied in India some years ago, and she came back and taught me some of those. I've kind of forgotten them now, but tika ta te 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 tiki ti 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 tiki te 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 tiki ti te. And dance is accompanied by that in India. If you're familiar with any of the classical Indian dances, you would recognize that right away. Ti ta tiki ti te 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 ti te te tiki ti 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 ti, and so forth. Kathak is one of the classical forms of Indian dance that is built on this phenomenon that we're capable of, and is used in the religious way as an access, a deep access to our mystical beings that know by intuition and by spiritual openness, and the other realities become irrelevant. All right, that is deeply embedded in Christian mysticism, whether we know it or not. In modern period, we don't really see that very much at all. We're pretty cushy these days, but certainly, thank you, as John has already observed, is definitely present in many of the practices in India and other parts of the East, Indonesia too, and others. Okay. Okay, any comments or questions about that particularly? Oh, yes,
Ju-
Ed? Yeah, Ed?
I was wondering, um, it seems like the early Christians really didn't know what to make of this phenomenon of Jesus, and casting about for a framework to interpret his life, they went back to that Isaiah passage, 55, I think, chapter, about he was wounded for our transgressions, and he was silent. He took all this enormous punishment. Well pictured that movie, The Crucifixion, by I forgot the actor's name that directed it, but it was all about sacrifice. That was the heart of Judaic. So they turned Jesus into a sacrifice.
Uh-huh.
That's the interpretation that he died for our sins, a necessary sacrifice. And now the themes of sacrifice are appearing in this period. And you mentioned the extreme stress positions and shedding everything in order to live in a hut, and all the other sacrificial what manners of piety. Did you see any thread in that, where that they were saying, well, Jesus suffered, so we have to suffer?
Yeah, yes, of course. There were monastic practices, or, well, hermit practices, even what's called eremitic practices, which is extreme hermitage. That is, you live absolutely alone.
No.
There's some of those that are still left in Cappadocia, the monks that live alone in the caves in these odd shaped mounds, hills and mounds. You've seen those pictures before. That kind of separation is of that quality. And I suppose that the flagellants are what inheritors of that tradition. Yeah. Which we've seen even in the movies of Bergman, for example, and others. Yeah. The flagellate, that is, the individuals that whip themselves to suffer as Jesus suffered, and that expiates our sins, apparently. Well, yeah, no doubt, that was among the practices of certain of the mystics of that era and that period. Of course, they're not typically or likely to be the writers like Pseudo Dionysius and like Johannes and so on. So the records of that are reported. What little bit I've seen, I had to forbear and not try to search that out too much. I was already so strung out. But yeah, and there are remnants of that appear, especially in the High Middle Ages, when the flagellati were an essential part of the Holy Week services, for example. And as I say, we see in some of the films of Bergman and others as well. The film you're referring to, you've talked about before, but I've never seen it.
Even today, Lent is associated with sacrifice and giving up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and a lot of that comes from the Desert Fathers, which we're approaching carefully. Well, all right. Let's move along. Any other comments or questions about this? Can you see how mysticism and its complexity is evolving in experience, in consciousness or awareness, I should say, and in moral, self-moral searching, and maybe even evaluating. Those all have to grow together. Anything that comes in that's just arbitrary doesn't work. But here's this amazing joining together of elements on the spiritual side. Now, simultaneously, and we don't have time to go into this, from the philosophical side are the elements of the one church that Constantine and the Holy Fathers were struggling with and working on and describing and so forth, was developing toward doctrine. How shall the church operate, and what shall we follow and believe? Like a catechism. Those are simultaneously happening. But of course, they're moving into each other's realms and hearing each other and so forth. That's where I say theology begins, is where the spiritual discoveries, creations, and so forth, and the doctrinal structures are merging, first intellectually probably, and then more and more deeply into what becomes Christian theology, which must incorporate both, or it's not Christian theology. Okay, so if you're beginning to see that developing in this first period, it just quite blows me away how that it's even subtle, actually, even though we have things like extreme positions and so forth. What's happening is multi-layered and deep. Okay, moving along here to Johannes Scotus Eriugena. There are two ways that his name is presented. John Scotus Erigena, which is the simple, basic one. Erigena refers to where he was born, somewhere in Ireland, nobody knows where, but that is an old term for Ireland, which actually was not differentiated from what we call Scotland today, because they were both early Gaelic speaking and Celtic in origin. So that's where he gets the Scotus. Whether there's no record of his spending any time in what is now Scotland, it was all Ireland or Irish or something like that. Eriugena. Jena, obviously, as in genetics and so forth, means of that, born of that, born of Ireland. And then he took on the first name rather than John, Johannes, because he became quite known and admired for his erudition. He was a philosopher who wrote quite eloquently and clearly in Latin, so it was available to people who were literate, certainly in those days, and could write in the Vulgate too. And he was hired by the king of he was a West Frankish king of the German people, the Gothic peoples. He was hired by them and worked in the court of King Charles II the Bald, I'll have you know. And okay, and his translations of Pseudo-Dionysius's work is still used by researchers today as the touchstone reference to the words of Dionysius the Areopagite, who was the fellow traveler with St. Paul. So what a thin but extremely fascinating and powerful line through this time period, this about 900 years or so of the first period. All right, so that's Johannes Scotus Eriugena. All right, he was a teacher and grammarian and a philosopher then under the King Charles II the Bald. All right, his principal theological work is on the division of nature. Now here's another complex but fascinating, really philosophical idea that if we look at it carefully and think about it, it becomes a spiritual idea. And and that's important to what we think. In that book on the division of nature is an attempt to reconcile the Neoplatonist doctrine of immanence with the Christian tenet of creativity. Now, I warned you to be careful if I made the mistake in the text itself. Beware of a misspelling of immanence. In my Tylenol fog, it came out in several different spellings, but I think I fixed it after I came out of the fog. So watch out for it. But this is immanence, which is pretty rarely used. We all know immanent, I-M, one M, E-N-E-N-T, imminent. No, maybe it's two M's. Anyway, that doesn't matter. Which refers to the coming of Christ. The time that Christ will come is imminent. But that's not the meaning here. This is immanence. And that's what's written in the text there very clearly. Immanence, that is the same puzzling conundrum that the philosophers over there on the left side are working on simultaneously. Philosophically, you see, if God, or the ultimate power, the primary power, the first cause, is one and is undifferentiated, like that compact black hole, though they didn't know anything about black holes in those days, but scientists can't help but see that that's part of the string of intellectual searching there, to go from the one that is undifferentiated and the black hole that presumably created and is creating the universe. All right, so how do you get three to come out of one if it's undifferentiated? It's a problem. Philosophically, if it's undifferentiated, there can't be three, that is, or two others, that is the Son and the Holy Ghost, coming out of it, or any other element, because any other element would not be, that would be the first cause, not the one. You see, it would predate the one. Oh dear. How do we deal with that and our Trinity? Well, this is the bridge that is much elaborated since Johannes, and oh boy, worked over and over again by the Christian philosophers. The immanence is like an essence, that there is just God, the one, the first cause. And the one, the essence of the one, extends into the universe and creates the universe, not just extends into it. The universe doesn't pre-exist. It extends and creates the universe as it expands. Those are, and that itself produces by immanence such things as the divine Son, S-O-N. And that power, the original, the creative power, there directs that specifically in his Son to come to earth to inform us about, well, God, and carrying the moral messages to support and perpetuate creativity, creation. We are to do that, and we do that with love. Okay, and that is what Hildegard and Julian and Teresa and who all else say. That's how we join with God, we call that power, in perpetuating creativity by creating. Think back to that wonderful, well, it looks like a plate that we looked at of Hildegard's that shows in a circular manner the seasons of the year and the trees with the apples falling and the rain and so forth. That beautiful disc that she and probably her secretary or some of her nuns made together. There it is. Our participation in creating, and that is the love which we give to the earth, the plants, the flowers, the animals, the bees, by working in the earth. And it calls back to mind too what I read to you. I think I did, or what? Oh, maybe it was just the Thursday class. Did I read to you some of Julian's wonderful sayings? I know I told you one or two. I told you all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all, yeah, manner of things shall be well. That's lovely. Let me tell you another. The Thursday class got this because there are fewer of them, and I guess anyway. She also says, be a gardener, dig a ditch, toil and sweat, and turn the earth upside down and seek the deepness. Do you hear darkness in that? Yeah, but seek the deepness. And water plants in time. Continue this labor and make sweet floods to run, and noble, sorry, I can't get the light right. Noble, abundant fruits to spring. Take this food and drink. This is sounding like the Eucharist, you see. This food and drink, and carry it to God as your true worship. There's Julian in her many wise and fetching phrases and turns of phrase. Well, there it is later on, how it is evolved. You can see right away from these earlier expressions of that seem so difficult to grasp at first, but become active and integrated and whole as mysticism, as an essential part of Christianity, evolves itself. It doesn't just change arbitrarily, it evolves out of this. So here's Johannes. The work classifies, this is his written work, nature into 4 elements. Now, we're not going to dwell on them too long. Or 4, not elements, well, observation of nature. And this you'll hear right away. It sounds like a scientist in the laboratory saying, well, there's this, and there's this, and there's this. Well, here it is. There are 4. 1, that which creates and is not created. The first one. Oh, well, as further thinking comes to, God was never created. God is. That's all there is to it, and always was. God is eternity. Now, special powers and grants are given to the word eternity. It's not just an offhand forever. It is that which is not created and is not, and it's therefore its creation never ends. All right. And it is, this number 1, that which creates and is not created. That's God who creates through love and through our actions. That comes up in the third period, of course, where we co-create, but hold on to that. That comes later. All right. Then the second one, that which creates and is created. I have to think a while about that. I'm not going to do it right here, but you might. Third, that which does not create and is created. Rocks. Let me see. Whatever. And it might not even be hard physical things. All right. And number 4, that which does not create and is not created. That's nothing, isn't it? It doesn't create and it is not created. That is, it's not eternal. Well, so he, Johannes, so carefully looks like the philosopher scientists that are working over kind of next to him there somewhere are, he breaks it down and then builds up from there. So therefore, what is God and the power of God? Now, I've already mentioned, again, like previews of coming attractions, though we've already been there. Just think how the mystics of the second period, from Hildegard on clear up to Teresa Avila and St. John of the Cross, how creative, well, and of course, especially St. Francis and St. Clare, that is their mode of living, the creativity by, and therefore the continuation of that which is created, God's power, by nurturing the animals, the plants, things that grow, and of course the people that are around them, specifically the poor, as St. Clare was devoted to in her order for the poor women of Damiano, who, as Harvey pointed out to us, did not come from poor families. They divested themselves of their wares and goods. This is going to be important now when we get to the Desert Fathers, and continue their lives in service to the poor, orphans and hungry children and so forth. All right, here's another very significant stream that is building and occurring in the evolution of mysticism and of doctrine in the church in its own way. We're not going to be on that side of the picture, at least not very long, but occasionally refer to it. Doctrine gets stuck on itself because it's a product of reason, and we're warned on that by several writers. Don't get stuck there now. It's time that you take a little trip over to the mystical side. Maybe that's what Hildegard meant when she said a healthy mysticism. Aha! Think on that. Okay. Now this is something of a mind bender, these 4 parts, but it leads to the concept or a belief when it is religiously applied. Divine God is eternal, meaning that God has not created, and that as Jesus was created, he was not divine until he was resurrected by God. Wow. Think of, by immanence, was Jesus already divine? Or was it an absolute miracle made by God, of course, that Jesus was created out of this immanence as a man on earth? Now, at least 44 times that I know of, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. He doesn't say the Son of God. And others refer to him that way too. Now, there are many ways of interpreting what that means, and I've come across them. But one of them is very deliberately, I am the Son of Man. Well, this is tangible. This is a thing of the senses and of reason too. So, but becomes divine and therefore eternal by joining that. Wow, we're getting into some pretty thick theology here that is quite mind-bending. Okay, now actually, Johannes did not accept this thesis, at least not at first. So he was one of the main minds that conceived of this, and they said, no. Nor did the Catholic Church at that time. It had become Catholic. It wasn't just a general Christianity anymore. Drawing from a Neoplatonic concept of the multiplicity of things in the universe to be created by the one, that is the first cause in philosophical terms, is by eminence from that one. God is that one, and his, if you pardon the expression, his Son is divine eminence of one. Whew. All right, boy, there's a jump of faith. But we can see how that thinking is so much a part of mystical thinking, of mystical being. I shouldn't say thinking, because that's a product of reason, of being, of healthy, I think Hildegard would agree, of healthy mysticism, living in the miracle of creation. And of course, Julian calls that love in her wonderful book, Revelations of Divine Love. Okay. Anybody want to toss in some comments or corrections, or shall we just let that mull? Yeah, righty. I'm
Well,
not. Yeah, Ed.
we're coming up on him. St. Thomas Aquinas, even I've heard priests and theologians in the Catholic Church exclaim they still follow him. They think he's the greatest thinker that ever lived.
Yeah.
He tried to unify all knowledge, not just theology, but encompass all
Yeah.
philosophy and sciences and everything into one
Yes.
master mold. But as in his older years, he had an experience, and that's the defining thing. Mysticism is an experience.
Yes.
And he never wrote another thing after that, in the 6 years until his death. And when people asked him, why aren't you continuing writing even more now that you've had this experience? He says, everything I've ever written seems like garbage.
Yeah.
Yeah. The reason and thinking just don't only go so far, and to experience reality
Yes.
is so far beyond trying to analyze it.
Yeah. Well, that's where the word ineffable becomes really accurate and meaningful.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, as we know, and we'll be seeing in the next class, so many mystics say that very thing. Saint Teresa of Avila said, less words, more experience. Right on the head of the nail, right?
Yep.
And others. I'll quote a little bit from Ram Dass and so forth too. Okay, but that's up in period 3, which maybe you're seeing elements of already. I'm sure you are if you've followed even a little bit Richard Rohr and Matthew Fox certainly, and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And we'll spend some time with him in our last class. All right, then the Desert Fathers and Mothers out of this period are extremely important. I won't spend much time because the Johannes stuff you got to process for quite a while, but it's written down if you want to get references back again. I don't have answers. There really are the questions, the profoundest questions. Yeah, well, the Desert Fathers and then the mothers too afterward was founded by Anthony the Great. They were Roman Catholic Christians, and were being persecuted terribly by Diocletian thing. What's his name? Anyway, I mentioned him later. And so they left Rome and went to the deserts of Egypt. A particular desert to start with, Cetes, S-C-E-T-E-S, Cetes, is a desert northwest of Cairo, today's Cairo, and became monks. And there they were for many years and practiced monasticism. Okay, let me see. Let me cut through here because I want to have a little time to show you a couple of images. Anyway, records tell that Anthony heard a Sunday sermon while he was in Rome around 270, stating that perfection could be achieved by selling all of one's possessions, giving the proceeds to the poor, and following Christ. Now that's in Matthew 19:21. Inspired, he departed for the desert to seek solitude. This was in a time of transition for Christianity. Emperor Diocletian his persecutions were the last ones of his were formally performed on Christians in the Roman Empire under him. 10 years later, Emperor Constantine I made Christianity legal, though he himself was not baptized until he lay on his deathbed. And he called for the Council of Nicaea. We've already mentioned that. Okay, the practices of desert monasticism had far-reaching influence on the mystics of the Middle Ages, that is period 2, as I've marked it out, and religious renewals in period 3, such as, now catch this, German evangelicals, the Pietists in Pennsylvania, and the Methodist revival in England. Ta-da! They were all influenced by the Desert Fathers and the Mothers who dedicated their lives and work to children of the poor and orphans. There's an St. Clare's imitation, so to speak, imitation. Of course, it was totally genuine in her, of what the Desert Mothers dedicated themselves to centuries before. Okay, and there is one quote here from a writing by the Desert Fathers in what's called the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, and that has been preserved by various languages. Will go well to end this story, which I've told you very little. And it says, "Sit in thy cell, and thy cell will teach thee all." Yeah. Well, that sounds a lot like Julian to me. She did it literally, didn't she? Had the cell built, and she went and sat in there for 16 years and wrote beautifully. Well, there we have it. Just for a little break, this has been a long session, and I've talked a lot, but I hope it's made sense for you. I want to show you 3 pictures of these people. Of course, nobody knows quite what they look like or at all what they looked like, but just for a little imagetic break here before we part. Here, I'm going to screen share. Ta-da. Wait a minute. I think I can get it to come up. And share. Hello. Come up. Here it comes. Well, the blue line is creeping across 2 or 3 times. Oh, lost. All right, let me see here. Oh, it's supposed to be so easy. Okay, you're not seeing this though, are you?
No,
Oh, darn
Oh,
it.
but it looks beautiful.
Jim, if I could bring this, you're still here, Jim?
I am.
Oh, yeah. Can you bring it from your screen? There's Pseudo Dionysius, the Areopagite.
I don't think, have you sent me the latest?
Oh dear, no, I haven't.
I don't have those 3 pictures, I don't think.
Oh, drat, I did something wrong here in the chat. Let me go back.
Okay. So,
Yeah,
so go ahead and just get rid of your chat screen. You don't need
Fine.
that. Go down to your bottom and click
Yeah.
the green button.
well, see, I've got the actual images are up so that that green button isn't. Drat.
Okay,
Mm,
John, probably what you did,
escape. Yeah.
yeah, get out of your, the PowerPoint that you're in. That's probably what you're looking at. And so what you need to do is get back to where you see all of our beautiful faces.
Yes, I know, and I'm looking for you.
Okay?
It
The
doesn't
way to do it
escape.
might be to click the I'm sorry, the zoom button in your bottom line.
Yeah. Oh, hi.
Got us?
Yeah,
All
yeah,
right.
I do. And then you've got me again.
Now
Okay,
put
where
your
shall I?
button.
So do share screen again.
Uh-huh.
All right. All right. Now it says Dropbox. I don't want that.
No.
Should I go to?
Find the PowerPoint one.
Yeah, there. It doesn't show PowerPoint. Oh, maybe I've got it. All right. It's got the blue border around it.
Yeah, and then push share.
Okay.
There we go.
So now you're seeing it. Oh,
Now we're
dandy.
seeing it.
there,
Okay.
yay!
Yay. Oh, thanks for your patience. Oh, between this and my Tylenol fog, I'm mortal, you see. Uh, let's see. I want this to enlarge, and I do that by what did I say
Just a
before?
little bit
Oh,
below where your arrow is. Yeah.
oh yeah. That's right. My little screen. Come on. Come on.
There you go.
You can do it. Oh, okay. And I don't, here we go. Here's Pseudo Dionysius, the Areopagite. Oops, darn it. And I just wanted you to see the frontispiece of one of the current books that is out that is quite good. I actually read quite a bit in it. The Dionysius, the Areopagite, and it's translated by William Riordan. Of course, nobody knows what he actually looked like, but there are several books, and it's really fascinating if you want to get into it. Okay, and here we go. The Desert Fathers. This is might be the oldest representation of the Desert Fathers. Now, my pictures of all of you are overlapping that. Let me see. Let me go back again.
We can see them really
yeah.
well though, John.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's.
So just
Whoops.
push your up and down buttons and you should get to it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I'm doing.
Oops.
But I also have a slight palsy. So. Okay. Yeah. So this is the oldest I could find. There are many images that represent the Desert Fathers, one of Anthony himself, and quite a few iconic images. You know what icons are. The Russian Orthodox Church uses them a great deal, and some from Ethiopia, which are really quite beautiful and representing Anthony and others of the Desert Fathers. And you can easily find those on Wikipedia. All right, and finally, here's Johannes. This is a Renaissance painting, so this person was nowhere near Johannes to do this image. And I've seen this image or this face applied to other saints. So, you know, artists rely on their other artists to say, oh, I need a face in here for Saint whoever. And well, why don't you use this one? So this is probably not a whole lot like him, though there are very primitive sketches and the likes, and he's not quite in this position. But here's dear Johannes. I've grown quite fond of him, actually. I identify with him. And of course, as is typical of Renaissance paintings, here are attributes. Here's his writing that's in his arm, and then the church. He was very devout, Catholic, of course, and there is the sunburst amulet there that's affixed to the front of his monk's cope. And of course, his head is shaved too in a peculiar way for that time. He's tonsured, it's called. I am completely tonsured, and he is monkishly tonsured. Okay. So anyway, just a few images to finish off with there, because it's been a lot of talking for a long time, and I wanted to give that a little breath. All right, any closing comments and things from folks? Yeah.
Good job. Thanks, John.
Yeah, you bet. You betcha. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for
Thank
listening.
you, John.
You bet. Thank you. Thanks, Harvey.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
That's
good.
a lot of work, and plus digesting all of this. Wow.
There's a lot. There's a lot to it, isn't there? And I'm glad. I hope you enjoy finding things out for yourselves as well. In fact, I encourage, if you'd like to, next week I'll be concentrating on the third period, because there's a lot of interpretation that has to go on there too. But we've had a good lead in of things to think about and account for as we move into the third period of the mystics. It's quite fascinating too. But if you'd like to, it's very easy to look up any one of the people in the list there and read about them. Find out, about, well, I found out about Marjorie Kemp kind of accidentally, and I'm glad I did. It was rather entertaining.
The notorious Marjorie Kemp. That's how it's known.
Yes.
I think all of us
Yeah.
have been notorious in one spectrum.
Yeah.
She was known as the notorious Marjorie Kemp.
Marjorie Kemp, yes, with her 14 children produced through celibacy.
And she after that said, get away.
Okay, well, let us take a break, folks. It's good to see
Good
you,
night.
and I'll
Thank
see
you,
you.
Tom.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Thanks.